Georgia is for sale. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Georgia is for sale. The price? $4 billion. That's the number that Georgia has agreed to sell the busy Georgia 400 corridor for. In case you haven't heard, which most of you probably haven't as this stuff doesn't get much major media attention, Georgia recently put up for sale the long-planned Express Lanes project in Atlanta's northern suburbs. The project went to the highest bidder, which in this case was a company named SR 400 Peach Partners. On this video, we're going to get into it, guys. I've seen a lot of opinions about this project all over social media, and we're going to address that, as well as dive into the good, the bad, and the ugly about this project and Atlanta's traffic issues in general. So let's get into it. Before we discuss the project itself, I want to bring you all up to speed on exactly what Georgia 400 is. Georgia 400 is a state highway that runs north-south in the Atlanta metro area. It departs from I-85 in the Buckhead neighborhood of the city and heads due north to where it then travels into the northern Fulton County suburbs of Sandy Springs, Alpharetta, and Roswell. It continues north into Forsyth County as a freeway until just north of the county seat of Cumming, where it reverts to a standard 4-lane divided highway with grade crossings and traffic lights. In Forsyth and beyond, the Georgia 400 corridor is primed for more development as the continuation of Atlanta's massive sprawl to the north. US 19 is also concurrent with the route and is one of the few places where the state route designation supersedes the US route. The areas that Georgia 400 traverses are among the wealthiest and fastest growing in the Atlanta metro area. As people continue to flock to Atlanta suburbs, the pressure on Georgia 400 has grown exponentially. If you look at the development pattern around Atlanta, you'll see that the lion's share of the growth is in its northern suburbs, and the sprawl continues to expand mostly in that direction. Georgia 400 is 6 to 8 lanes throughout most of the suburbs and 6 lanes inside of Buckhead. While the section in Buckhead usually doesn't have too many issues, once you get north of I-285, the perimeter is where the fun begins in the area that this project is supposed to target. Up here, it is pure insanity. The speed limit up here is a mere suggestion, and it's not uncommon to see several drivers going in excess of 85 miles per hour, with not a police officer in sight. It is jokingly referred to by some as the Atlanta Autobahn. Currently, Georgia 400 carries 278,000 vehicles per day, according to Georgia DOT, and they project that it will carry 346,000 by 2046. It's not uncommon to see traffic jams and congestion form during the middle of the day randomly. Another thing to note is that MARTA has a heavy rail line that runs along Georgia 400, giving those in Buckhead, Sandy Springs, and Dunwoody the ability to use transit rather than take the highway. It ends at the North Springs station in Sandy Springs, which is where this project is supposed to begin. So exactly what is this project? The Georgia 400 Express Lanes project is a project that's planned to add 2 tolled travel lanes to each side of the highway for a total of 4 new lanes. The express lanes will use dynamic pricing that adjusts depending on the amount of congestion in the general purpose lanes, meaning that it will be more expensive to use them when traffic is bad compared to slower periods of the day. The interior of the roadway will have a MARTA bus rapid transit lane down the middle for a total of 2 lanes. There will be a park and ride lot at the Windward Parkway along with transit stations at Holcomb Bridge Road and North Point Mall for BRT access. The agency has agreed to provide $26 million to MARTA for that portion of the project. The overall roadway will top out with a massive total of 16 lanes. 5 general purpose lanes on each side, 2 express lanes on each side, and 1 BRT lane on each side. It is to run from the North Springs MARTA station in Sandy Springs up to the McFarland Parkway in unincorporated Forsyth County. This is basically a complete rebuild of the roadway and is a gargantuan infrastructure project. Construction is projected to start in Q3 of 2025 and be completed by 2031. The estimated cost in excess of $4 billion. And that's where Georgia 400 Peach Partners come in. Georgia has agreed to allow this consortium to build and then operate and maintain these express lanes for the next 50 years, with oversight from Georgia DOT. The Georgia State Transportation Board, who is appointed by the General Assembly, that you, the people of Georgia elected, agreed unanimously to the bid. This is a major milestone, Georgia Commissioner of Transportation Russell McMurray said, following the 2 votes. We look forward to completing the journey. With more than 2.4 million Peach Pass trips being generated each month, Meg Perkle, chief engineer for the State Department of Transportation, said, I think it's safe to say that Metro Atlanta has embraced express lanes. Now that we know what the project entails, let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly about it. The good part is obvious. The roadway will be expanded to allow for more capacity in the form of toll lanes. Now, I know people feel a certain way about express lanes, but the harsh reality is that with the federal government being afraid to raise the gas tax for over 3 decades, and construction costs and inflation continuing to increase, you're going to have to get used to many new roads and roadway improvements being paid for with direct user fees. Or would you rather have $6 a gallon gas? Express lanes make roadways generate direct revenue that can be used to maintain or improve the roadway, but also still maintains the free lanes that others can use should they not want to pay the tolls. Now, some will say that this favors wealthier people, which is true, but so do sales taxes. So it is what it is on that front. As someone who's been all over the country and observed and analyzed traffic from various metro areas, I'll tell you that anything beyond 4 general purpose lanes on each side of the roadway is typically a waste. You reach a point of diminishing returns with everything past that. And you can see the Katy Freeway in Houston for reference. So with the Atlanta area being unable to build any completely new roadways as alternatives to Georgia 400 or I-285, you really have no choice in this metro but to try and find ways to tweak or improve the existing roads. Also, these lanes, at least in theory, will take a certain amount of drivers off of the general purpose lanes to make those flow more smoothly as well. But then wouldn't that make the toll operator make less money? We'll get to that part later. Then there are the BRT lanes. Currently, the MARTA train ends at North Springs and Sandy Springs. Due to either funding or lack thereof, or political fear of extending the route further north, the rail line has never been built past here, even though Sandy Springs and Alpharetta are in Fulton County. So BRT looks like it's the best that you're going to get as far as transit goes north of this point. Then finally, there is the money. As the governor has boasted about, the project will not cost the state any money up front, as the private entity is agreeing to front the $4.6 billion price tag for the project. But we can't forget to mention that Georgia had a $16 billion tax surplus. So this allows the governor a dual political victory, a tax surplus refund, and selling the highway to a private company to, quote, not cost the taxpayers anything. You have to pay attention to the clever political speak. And of course, the current governor will be long gone by the time this all fully plays out. It all sounds good so far, right? But let's get into the bad side of things. First off is the fact that the project is privately operated. When you hear the word private, you should also think of the word profit. And that's the biggest downside of the project. A private entity is in business to make money, not improve traffic flow. You see, when you have this combination of express lanes and general purpose lanes, the idea in terms of efficiency is to keep the overall traffic on the roadway moving at a certain speed. In engineering, we call that level of service. I'm not going to get into the technical definitions on this video, but with these express lanes, the ideal level of service is for people in the express lanes to be able to move at a minimum of 45 miles per hour. So ideally, the express lanes would have a pricing structure that encourages a certain amount of drivers to use them in order to take a certain amount of traffic out of the general purpose lanes. But then there's a conflict of interest. If the traffic is flowing too well in the general purpose lanes, then there is less incentive for people to use the express lanes. The operator then doesn't make the desired amount of revenue. The other bad thing is that the 6 years that it's going to take for this to be completed will be quite painful for those who use the roadway. Get used to a lot of detours, a lot of delays, and traffic pattern changes. Atlanta is already notorious for its lack of major arterial routes, so Georgia 400 being under construction is going to be an absolute nightmare, as you really don't have many alternatives to choose from. I'm glad I don't live there. Now for the ugly. The terms of the agreement don't appear to be available publicly anywhere, but typically what you see with these lanes is a clause about competition, meaning that the state will not be allowed to build anything that might hurt revenue that the private company generates from the roadway. This means no roadways that might encourage drivers to avoid Georgia 400 could be built. This could mean improving nearby surface roads or freeways that might cause drivers to choose them over Georgia 400. And bear in mind that this is for 50 years. So for 50 years, Georgia will not be able to build anything that might compete with Georgia 400 for travelers. And this also likely means that any of you who are dreaming of some type of MARTA rail expansion north of Sandy Springs can forget about it. This project is likely the death knell for any aspirations of rail beyond Sandy Springs. Then there's the question of what happens should the toll operator not hit their desired revenue targets. Is the state on the hook to make up the difference? Or being that this entity appears to be formed specifically for this project, could they do what some other failed toll projects have done around the country and declare bankruptcy if they don't make their money? These are risky scenarios that I haven't seen answers from the state to the general public as of yet. And finally, if you want to see how this type of project usually works, look no further than baby Atlanta over in North Carolina. In Charlotte, North Carolina, a very similar project was done between downtown and its wealthy northern suburbs along Interstate 77. The announcement of it was met with heavy political backlash, and the residents in that area played a big role in getting then Governor Pat McCrory up out of there. A fine example of voters making their voice count and actually participating in the process, rather than just posting empty complaints on social media. And here we are years later, and I-77 isn't much better in that area, and the express lanes are very lightly used. And one reason that I noticed when I lived in Charlotte was that the price of the lanes was usually pretty high, to the point where most drivers were discouraged from using them. So the general purpose lanes stayed mostly as congested as they always were, and only those with deep pockets usually using the toll lanes. Which goes back to my point about the motivations of private entities when it comes to these type of express lanes. And finally, I want to get into some of the responses that I've seen to this project across social media. You see, when things like this get announced, I see all the opinions open up, and everyone has something to say. But when it's time to choose the leadership who makes these decisions, it's crickets. So let's get into some of that. First, let's get into the common complaint. We don't need more roads. We need more public transit. Anytime a roadway project is announced, you can commonly see this pretty much everywhere online. And let's take a look at the existing MARTA rail line in the area. It runs from downtown Atlanta through Midtown Buckhead and up to Sandy Springs and Dunwoody. I've ridden on this route personally several times, and I have never seen one of the train cars full. You can drive on Georgia 400 and see the MARTA train zipping past the cars on the roadway, yet most people will still drive. Georgia 400, even if we assume one person per car, is still moving more people than the train is. And the first response to the post is right on the money. The people in these places, Alpharetta, Sandy Springs, Roswell, mostly wouldn't use the transit even if it were free. Now, this guy below him who responded is actually onto something, but not for the reason that he thinks. He says that projects like this feed the cycle of poor land use. Well, I have news for you, my guy. The land use that you have in these suburbs is what you are voting for. Every single structure, home, building, street, park, sidewalk, every single concrete slab that gets placed in your city gets approved by the leaders that you have selected to make those decisions. Not Trump, not Harris, not Biden, not Obama. Your local and state representatives determine how your cities look. Developers want to make money, and they're going to build to the minimum standards that your local leadership requires of them. Yep, the zoning regulations are also courtesy of the leadership that you selected. Fulton County, 2019, 12% turnout. Abysmal. This includes Alpharetta, Sandy Springs, Atlanta, Roswell, and all other municipalities in Fulton County. So from what I see, when it counts, most of you love that type of land use because that is what you vote for. And not voting also means that you agree with whoever wins the election. That style development that you, the people of Georgia, are choosing also means that transit simply wouldn't have much effect on roadway traffic even if it were built. If you look at Atlanta's northern suburbs, you'll see that it's mostly a mass of sprawling subdivisions, with many shopping centers and big box stores here and there, with the occasional luxury apartment complex. So can someone tell me where you'll put a rail line through these areas that will actually pull enough users off the road to impact traffic? If I live in a single family home in one of these suburbs, trying to ride transit means I likely have to get in my car, drive to the station, park there, then transfer to the transit line, which is a fixed route. There's nothing within walking distance and nowhere that you can put a rail line that would make it effective in these types of areas, even if you could theoretically ignore money and politics. It ends up just being more convenient to take the entire trip by car, even in slow moving traffic. So you vote for sprawling subdivisions and you expect rail to do anything out here? It doesn't add up. The next commenter, she has the right idea on paper, except it just doesn't work like that in reality. Atlanta already has some of the worst traffic in the country and is well known to be terrible. Yet people keep flocking here to the metro area in droves despite that traffic. You see, most people are moving here for the cost of living because those single family homes are cheaper than the states that they're fleeing from. The job market is pretty solid as well. Most Americans will actually tolerate terrible traffic if it means they can obtain a cheaper home. I mean, we can look at New York. Driving there is already one of the most stressful experiences in the country, yet its roads stay clogged and they're trying to add yet another tax to further discourage driving. So the do nothing option, while it makes sense in theory, it just doesn't play out in reality. A good example is Austin, Texas, where they had an if you don't build it, they won't come mentality for quite a while. Well, they didn't build it, and they came anyway, and they came in droves. Now today, as a result, Austin, despite being the smallest of the big four Texas metros, has the worst traffic in the entire state and is now trying to build out its roadway network. And the final thing I want to address is about the myth of transit being the solution to American traffic, which is definitely at play here in Atlanta. Let's talk about reality for a moment. Oftentimes, transit is plagued by large amounts of homeless, vagrant, and various mentally ill people populating the trains and buses. And the transit stops themselves are often overrun with these things as well, further discouraging their use by the general population. This makes the people who you want most to use the transit instead avoid it and just drive. No one wants to sit and watch open drug use, be constantly pestered, or have to be on heightened alert just to get where you need to be. People will instead just hop in their car. Now, some people are going to say, well, they never bothered me, but that's not the point. Would you want your wife, your girlfriend, or your kids in this environment daily? No. I've seen and witnessed it firsthand, and this stuff usually scares off many of the people who ideally you would otherwise want to use transit, at least in theory. When you make decent income and can afford to drive or pay for Uber, you simply just don't want to deal with it. And this is a nationwide societal issue that I've yet to see addressed and is often avoided in conversation by those who think transit is the magic elixir. The only place where I've seen it not occur was on Brightline in Florida, and that's due to the cost of ridership being high enough to exclude certain people from using it. But then, if the price is too high, then driving still ends up winning due to being cheaper. So the on-paper, video game idealistic fantasies of transit being an easy solution just don't pan out in reality when you actually look at all the real-world factors. Let me tell you a secret, guys. I've been 16. I've been 21. I know how things could theoretically work if we can ignore reality and play God mode like SimCity. So don't bother giving me the fantasy scenarios under my videos unless you have a politically feasible action plan behind it. You see, people like the idea of transit, but no one actually wants to use transit when it comes down to it. Most people don't even know their local bus routes and schedules and never even bother to look them up. Clamoring for transit has become similar to clamoring for affordable housing. Everyone claims to want more affordable housing until that affordable housing is proposed in their neighborhood. Affordable housing is great as long as you build it over there, away from me. Transit is great as long as I can still drive and I don't have to use it. Doing nothing isn't going to make transit more attractive. Fixing transit is going to make transit more attractive. But the million-dollar question is how? I've yet to hear a tangible answer. So ultimately, we can conclude that with Atlanta Metro's style of development, the apathy of the voting population who lets their leaders do whatever they want and don't hold them accountable, and the issues with existing transit, that this express lane project is pretty much all that can be done to even take a stab at the traffic issues that plague the region. You can't build new roads and you can't build new train lines. Atlanta is uniquely bad at both transit and roads compared to similar metros. And in the end, you're left with two choices in the Atlanta area. Do nothing and leave things as they are, or do something similar to this Georgia 400 project. My biggest gripe with it is the project being sold off to a private entity when the state has more than enough money to pay for it themselves. At the end of the day, Georgia 400, even when this project is completed, will again be congested because the population in these northern suburbs will continue expanding and exploding for the foreseeable future. And after traveling around the US and observing multiple metro areas, the only places with reasonably flowing traffic are those that are either stagnant in population growth, losing population, or those that have been able to build out a massive roadway network relative to their population. The express lanes are just a way for those who can afford them to have a more convenient drive. And the BRT is basically a symbolic gesture and is practically useless in this area. But for the paltry amount of people who will ride, it's a lower cost alternative to building out and expanding the rail line. But then again, who in Alpharetta is going to drive to a parking ride to get on BRT and then get into the city? But all is not lost. There is an answer to the problem of sprawling, traffic-plagued suburbs and their lack of walkability. After traveling all over the country and actually taking into account all the factors that decide how our cities look, I have reached the conclusion for you. What is the solution if you don't like this project or those like it? If you want walkability to where you don't have to use your car, move to where what you want already exists. Clearly, either the people who claim to want transit and walkability either don't vote or are just a vocal minority So moving to places like Alpharetta, Sandy Springs, Forsyth, and Cobb counties and whining about traffic is like moving to Arizona and crying about the heat. Politics matter. Money matters. Socioeconomic status matters. Schools, crime, personal preference, all matter. You already knew what it was before you got here. Vote with your feet. Because from what I've seen, nothing is changing. If we're being honest, most Americans want a single family home on a large lot. It is the American dream, and that type of development directly translates to a car on the road, not a person sitting on a train or a bus. Even one of your top presidential candidates keeps talking about helping you afford a house, not an apartment, not a duplex. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the scenery on Georgia 400. Georgia should have at least built that outer perimeter when they had the chance. Transit is dead in Atlanta, particularly outside the perimeter. Bad traffic is permanent here, so you better get used to it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.